My name is Clara Whitmore, and I was 19 years old the night my father tore my entire future in half right there at the dinner table. The acceptance letter I had spent 4 years working toward, the one I had built from nothing with my own 2 hands at a public library table, sat between the mashed potatoes and the gravy boat. And by the end of that meal, it was 2 ragged pieces of paper lying beside my plate, like something disposable. My father said no daughter of his was going to waste good money on school. My mother stared at her lap. My whole family sat there and let it happen. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word in my defense. But there was one thing about that house, one quiet thing my father had never bothered to look closely enough to see. One thing my grandmother had been holding carefully and patiently for a very long time. What she slid across that dinner table 2 weeks later is the reason I am sitting here telling you this story today.
Welcome to Story Sentence, where quiet women win the loudest battles without ever once raising their voices. If a family that undervalued you ever made the mistake of underestimating exactly what you were capable of, this story is for you. Stay with me until the end, because I promise you the ending will surprise you. And when it does, drop a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe to Story Sentence so you never miss what comes next. We lived in the house my grandfather built with his own 2 hands, a tall white farmhouse at the end of Hollow Creek Road, and everything about that house had a place. The coats hung left to right by height on iron hooks my grandfather had hammered into the wall himself. The good china plates came down exactly twice a year, Thanksgiving and Christmas, and the dining table seated 8, though we were only 5. My father sat at the head of the table always, where the overhead light was brightest and warmest, where the carving fork was always set, where the best view of the window looked out over the fields he believed he owned. That was the rule nobody ever wrote down, but everyone understood. My father at the head, my mother, Vivian, to his right, my younger brother, Brandon, across from her, and me, wherever there was room to be useful. I was the one who carried the heavy dishes from the kitchen to the table and back again. I refilled the water glasses before anyone had to ask. When my parents began to circle toward an argument the way thunderclouds circle before a storm, I was the one who reached into the air and found a small, harmless joke to set down between them like a soft cushion. I had been doing it for so long and so automatically that I had stopped knowing I was doing it at all. It had become as natural to me as breathing. And at the far end of the table, in the chair closest to the old window that rattled every winter, sat my grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore. Ellie, she allowed only me to call her, though I rarely did it to her face. She was 79 years old that spring, with a spine as straight as a fence post, and eyes that took in everything without ever appearing to try. She ate slowly and deliberately. She said very little. My father talked over her the way you leave a radio playing in another room, present but not really heard, not really considered. I used to wonder in the quieter corners of my own mind why she always chose that particular seat, the far end, the cold end, the end farthest from the warmth and the light and the power. I assumed she was simply old and enjoyed the view of the yard through the window. It would take the worst night of my life to make me understand that my grandmother Eleanor had never once needed to sit at the head of a table to own the entire room she was sitting in. She was waiting. I did not yet know what for. The letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late March, and I read it 4 full times standing at the mailbox at the end of Hollow Creek Road before I allowed myself to believe what it actually said. Full engineering scholarship, Harrington University, 312 miles away. A robotics and structural engineering program I had read about so many times that the pages of the printed brochure I had secretly picked up from the school library had gone soft at the folds. I had done every single piece of it entirely alone. I filled out the applications at the Millfield Public Library after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays because the family computer in the living room was designated for my father's business work and my brother's video games, and neither of those things left room for a girl with ambitions. I wrote my essays longhand in a spiral notebook I kept hidden under my mattress, then typed them up in 40-minute sessions before the library closed and the lights flickered twice as a warning. I asked my physics teacher, Mr. Okafor, for a recommendation letter and told him quietly, almost in a whisper, not to mention it to anyone.
I hid the whole thing the way you hide a small, fragile animal you are terrified someone will accidentally step on and crush without even meaning to. Nobody in my family knew I had applied. Nobody knew about the applications or the essays or the recommendation or the visits to the library. And now, standing at that mailbox in the late afternoon light, with a letter that said I had won, that I had actually won, the first thing I felt was not pride. It was not even relief. It was hope. A stupid, tender, terrifying hope that this, finally, would be the thing that made my father look at me differently. I pictured it clearly. The way you picture things you have rehearsed so many times, they feel like memory. I would set the letter down casually at dinner, and he would pick it up, and something would shift in his face. Some old calcification would crack open, and he would see it, see her, see the quiet daughter who had carried every dish and smoothed every silence, and had been this whole time building something real out of nothing but her own determination. I had spent 19 years trying to be useful enough, small enough, invisible enough to earn that single look, and I thought a piece of paper might finally be able to buy it. I folded the letter carefully into the inside pocket of my jacket and walked the long way home along the fence line, past the winter fields that were just beginning to show green, rehearsing how I would say it, casual, easy, like it was simply a piece of good news and not the most important thing that had ever happened to me. I did not know, walking down that road in the early spring air, that I was carrying the last hopeful version of myself, that by the time I walked back up that same road, everything would be different. I waited until we were all seated and the food had been passed around. My mother had made pot roast with roasted carrots and mashed potatoes, my father's favorite meal, which I told myself was a good sign, the way desperate people always read signs into ordinary things. Brandon was talking about a truck he had seen at the dealership in town. My grandmother was cutting her carrots into small, precise, identical squares, with the focused patience of someone doing something that mattered. And I reached into my jacket pocket, took out the letter, unfolded it carefully, and set it on the table next to my father's plate, as though it were nothing much at all. I said, as steadily as I could manage, that I had some news, that I had applied to Harrington for engineering, that they had awarded me a full scholarship, that it covered tuition, housing, and fees, that it would not cost him a single dollar. That last sentence I had practiced the most, out loud, alone in the bathroom with the faucet running, so no one would hear me rehearsing my own defense. My mother's fork stopped midway to her mouth and hung there in the air. Brandon looked back and forth between me and my father, already sensing the weather changing. My father set down his own fork slowly and picked up the letter. He read it. I watched his eyes move across the words, line by line, and for one single held breath, I thought I saw it, that thing I had been chasing my whole life, a flicker, a softening, a change in the set of his jaw. Then his jaw tightened instead. He turned the letter over as though looking for the catch, the trick, the fine print that would reveal it as a joke. Engineering, he said flatly. 300 miles away. It's a full ride, I said. Dad, I earned it. My grandmother at the far end of the table had gone completely still. She had stopped cutting her carrots. Her fork was resting on the edge of her plate, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was watching my father the way you watch a fire to see which direction it decides to go. My mother said his name, Douglas, in a voice that could have been either a warning or a plea. I could never tell the difference with her. My father held the letter up between the thumb and forefinger of one hand, like it was a piece of evidence he was examining in court. He was not smiling. He was doing the particular arithmetic that certain kinds of men do when a daughter steps out of the place they have assigned her, when she forgets herself, when she reaches for something they have already decided does not belong to her. No daughter of mine wastes money on school, he said, and then he tore the letter in half. He did it slowly, deliberately. He held both edges and pulled apart cleanly and unhurried, the way you tear a receipt or a grocery list, something with no more weight than that. The paper made a small, clean, ordinary sound. Nothing about that sound should have been able to end a life. He set the two pieces down next to the pot roast and picked up his fork. "You will stay here," he said. "You will learn to run a house properly. You will find a decent man, and that will be worth a great deal more to you than some degree you will never get a chance to use." My mother looked at her plate. Brandon looked at his. Nobody moved. The kitchen clock continued its loud, indifferent ticking, suddenly the only sound in the room. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and felt something inside my chest go cold and quiet and still, the way a house goes silent when the power cuts out, and you realize all at once how much noise it was making before. Here is the part I have spent years examining and still find difficult.
The part I am not proud of. I did not shout. I did not stand up from the table. I did not sweep every plate to the floor the way something ancient and righteous inside me desperately wanted to. At the far end of the table, my grandmother set her fork down with quiet precision in the exact center of her plate, and she folded both hands, and she looked at my father with an expression I had never once seen on her face before. Not anger, something older and colder and steadier than anger, something that had been waiting a very, very long time for this exact moment. My father did not notice. He was buttering his dinner roll, and in the silence I heard my own voice, small and terrified, and doing the only thing it knew how to do after 19 years of practice. "I'm sorry," I said. That is what I said. Not, "I earned this and you had no right." Not, "I have built something real and you just destroyed it." Not 19 years of every swallowed word and shrunk ambition and apology for existing. I said I was sorry, and then I reached across the table and picked up the 2/2 of my own acceptance letter and pressed the torn edges together, as though I might be able to mend them right there beside the gravy boat. "It's fine," I said to no one. "I'm sorry about dinner. Let's just eat." My father nodded, satisfied, because that was the daughter he had raised, the one who carried the plates and smoothed the silences and said sorry for daring to take up space. My mother's shoulders dropped an inch with relief. Brandon went back to talking about his truck. And I sat there with the pieces of my torn future pressed between my palms, and understood, with a clarity that felt like falling, that I had been doing this my entire life, making myself smaller so the people who undervalued me could stay comfortable, apologizing for the space my own dreams occupied.
Believing underneath everything that if I was just good enough, quiet enough, useful enough for long enough, eventually they would finally look up and see me and be glad I was there. I had been knocking on that door since I was small enough to reach the handle. And the worst part, the part that sat in my stomach like a stone as I carried the dishes to the sink that night, was that I still believed it might open. I still believed a torn letter could be taped, a man could be reasoned with, a father could still become one. I said sorry one more time for good measure as I ran the water, and I felt my grandmother's eyes on my back the whole time, steady and warm and heavy like a hand. Upstairs in my room, I taped the letter back together. I did it at my desk under the small lamp, slowly and carefully, matching the torn fibers the way you set a broken bone, trying to make the damage invisible. When it was reassembled, more or less, I read it through again, and near the bottom of the page I found the line I had overlooked in my joy at the mailbox that afternoon. Enrollment and scholarship confirmation due by May 1st, a deposit required to secure your place. I turned to the small calendar taped to my wall above the desk. It was the 22nd of March, 40 days until May 1st. No, I counted again, closer to 40. But between finishing senior year and the reality of what had just happened at that table, it felt like 10. I did the math the way I do everything, carefully, on paper, in columns. The deposit was $340. I had $289 saved from babysitting the Delaney children every Friday for the past 2 years. Not enough. The scholarship covered tuition and housing completely, but it did not cover the deposit that held the seat, and it did not cover the bus ticket, and it did not cover the small fee for the dorm key or the initial meal plan balance. The entire enormous gift that I had built from nothing was now balanced on a pile of dollars I could not reach in time. I taped the calendar to my desk where I would see it every morning, and I made myself a promise in a voice so quiet it barely left my own chest. I did not know how. I was not going to let a man who had never built anything in his life destroy the one thing I had built entirely on my own. Down the hall, a light was still burning under my grandmother's door. I noticed it. I did not yet know what it meant. The next morning, I tried the direct approach, because I still believed in direct approaches, the way you still believe in things before life has had time to fully educate you on their limits. I found my father in the kitchen with his first cup of coffee before the rest of the house was awake, and I sat down across from him, and I said as calmly and reasonably as I could that I had thought about everything, and I had a proposal. I would handle every cost myself. I would get a job. I would not ask him for a single thing. He would not have to pay a cent or sign a single document. I would come home for every holiday, and I would call every Sunday, and his life would be completely unchanged. I ever rehearsed it to sound small, unthreatening, reasonable, like a business proposition between two adults. He did not set down his coffee. "School doesn't teach a girl to run a household," he said, and the corner of his mouth pulled up like we were sharing a private joke. "You want to spend 4 years in some lecture hall chasing a degree that was built for men? That's a fantasy, Clara, not a plan." I looked past him to where my mother, Vivian, was standing at the stove with her back to both of us, stirring something she did not need to stir. "Mom," I said, just her name, a whole argument compressed into 2 letters. She did not turn around. She said, "Your father knows what is best for this family, Clara. He only wants to protect you from disappointment." And that was the moment the last wall I had been leaning on came down. Not my father. I had already known about him. My mother. The woman who was supposed to understand better than anyone what it cost to be a girl in this house had chosen to guard the cage instead. I nodded, because nodding was what I did. And my father, reading the ground as entirely his, delivered the line that would live in my chest for the next 2 weeks. "And Clara," he said, tapping the table once with the flat of 2 fingers, "you bring this school business up one more time, and you can find another roof to sleep under." He said it lightly, almost pleasantly, the way you would mention that it might rain this afternoon. Then he finished his coffee and left for the shop, and I stood in the kitchen with nowhere left to knock. That same afternoon, I walked into town and put in job applications everywhere that would take a paper from my hands without asking too many questions. The Morning Bell Diner on Carver Street, Grantham Supply Company on the main road, Pine Ridge Market on the county highway. I asked Mr. Grantham directly, looking him in the eye, whether he could pay me weekly in cash starting immediately, and how many hours he could offer a girl still finishing her senior year. I sat at the library and did the real mathematics, the honest and ugly kind, on a legal pad under the fluorescent lights. Even working maximum hours alongside school, I could not reach the deposit amount in the time remaining. I was not naive. I could see every wall clearly. I had simply run out of time to climb them. I called the financial aid office at Harrington and asked in the most professional voice I could manage whether there was any flexibility in the deposit deadline. There was not. I looked into a small personal loan and learned what every 19-year-old girl with no credit history and no cosigner learns quickly, which is that the world does not lend money to someone in my situation. Every asset I had was in my father's house, on his land with his name attached. I walked home in the dark past the spring fields and allowed myself for the first time to think the thought I had been keeping locked in the back of my mind all week, that maybe I was going to lose it, that maybe the taped letter would stay in my desk drawer as a souvenir of the year I almost escaped. And that night, my grandmother knocked on my bedroom door. She came in carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea, which she had never done before in my memory. She sat down on the edge of my bed as though she had always done it, and she handed me one of the mugs, and she waited. My grandmother had a way of waiting that made the truth easier to speak than to hold. So I told her. I told her about Harrington and the robotics lab and the structural engineering program, and the way numbers and load and tension and stress felt like the one honest language in a house full of things people never said aloud. I expected a polite nod, a pat on the hand, a gentle reminder to be realistic. Instead, her eyes changed. They sharpened and brightened, and she asked me a real question, a specific question about cantilever load and stress distribution, the kind of question you only ask if some part of you once wanted to understand the answer yourself. We talked for an hour. She asked me what the deposit amount was and when it was due, and I told her both numbers plainly, the way you tell things to someone who is really, truly listening. She did not offer me money.
She did not tell me everything would work out fine. She just took in every figure and every date, the way a person files something carefully away for future use. When she stood to go, she paused in the doorway and looked back at me. "Your grandfather," she said, "believed that a mind like yours was the most valuable thing any family could possess. He was wrong about most things in his life. He was right about that." Then she said goodnight, and she left me holding a cooling mug of tea and a question I could not yet name. After that conversation, I started to watch my grandmother in a way I had never bothered to before. I noticed that she left the house every Thursday morning, dressed in her good wool coat, and told anyone who asked that she was visiting an old friend in town. She had been doing this for years, apparently, and nobody had ever thought twice about it, because you do not examine the habits of a quiet old woman at the far end of the dinner table. But I was watching now. And on the Thursday of that second week, I was walking back from another fruitless job inquiry when I happened to look up and see my grandmother emerge from a low brick building on 2nd Street. There was a name on the glass door in raised gold lettering, Caldwell and Pierce Law Firm. She was holding a thick cream-colored envelope pressed flat against her chest, held there deliberately, the way you hold something that matters to you, something you are not ready to set down. She did not see me. I stood behind a parked pickup truck and watched my 79-year-old grandmother, the woman everyone in our family treated as furniture, tuck a law firm's envelope carefully into her handbag and walk to the bus stop with a straightness in her spine that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with purpose. I stood there on the sidewalk in the late morning and felt the shape of everything I thought I understood about my life begin to shift. I said nothing to her that evening. I did not know what words there were to say, but at dinner that night I watched her differently. My father held forth about the shop and the land and how one day all of it, the business and the property and the house itself, would pass to Brandon, because that was simply how things were done and always had been. My grandmother cut her carrots into small, even squares and said nothing at all, and I thought about the cream envelope pressed against her chest on a sidewalk outside a law office on a Thursday morning, and I understood, the way you understand something in your body before your mind catches up, that something was coming. I did not yet know its shape, but I could feel its weight in the room, the way you feel a storm before you see it. My father made his intentions official at the dinner table 2 nights later, though of course nothing about it was official. It was simply a man announcing a world he assumed without question that he controlled.
"Brandon," he said, "once you finish school, you'll come into the company. You'll learn it from the ground up, the way I did. And someday, all of it comes to you. The shop, the land, this house, everything I built. A man builds something so he has something to hand down to his son." Brandon was 16 and mostly thinking about his food, but he sat up slightly, the way you do when a room hands you something it has already decided belongs to you. And I felt it land on me too, the shape of everything I would never be allowed to have, spoken out loud plainly by a man who had never once asked me a single question about what I wanted or who I was, or what I was capable of building. Not because I had failed him, because I was a girl. My father was not being deliberately cruel. That is the part that is hardest to explain to people who have not lived inside that particular kind of family. He genuinely believed he was describing the natural order of the world, as reliable and obvious as gravity.
Sons build things. Daughters serve. Money invested in a son grows. Money spent on a daughter flows away like water through your fingers. He believed it as completely and unquestioningly as his own father had believed it before beating it into him, and he had never once thought to ask himself why in this particular house, in this particular family, it was his mother's name and not his own on every document that mattered. He did not know that yet. Neither did I fully. But I watched my grandmother lift her eyes from her plate and look down the length of that table at her son, while he divided up a kingdom that had never for a single day been his to give. And I saw something moved behind her eyes. Patience. And under the patience, so quiet you would miss it if you were not looking, the faintest edge of something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. Then she went back to her carrots and said absolutely nothing. I held myself together at the dinner table, the way I always had. But at night, in my room under the lamp, I was cracking along a seam I had been pressing closed for 19 years. 6 days left now. 5. The taped letter in my drawer felt like it was marking seconds. On the 5th night, my mother found me in the laundry room crying quietly into a folded bath towel, trying to make myself as small as possible while I fell apart. And instead of crossing the room and holding me, instead of sitting down on the dryer and asking me what was really wrong, she sighed. The long, put-upon sigh of a woman inconvenienced by her daughter's grief. "You're making your father miserable," she said. "He hasn't slept. All of this disruption over some school, Clara." I stared at her across the small room. She looked away. Not, "Is my daughter going to be all right?" Not, "What does she need?" "Look what your wanting is doing to the men in this house." And there it was, finally, completely bare. My mother had spent so many decades swallowing her own hunger and keeping the peace that she had forgotten she had ever been hungry. She had made herself into a keeper of a cage she was also locked inside, and now she was guarding it, fighting to keep others from climbing out, because a bird who has forgotten it has wings will always feel threatened by the ones who haven't. I loved her. That was the thing that made it hardest. I loved her, and I finally saw, clearly and completely, that she was not going to save me, that no one in that house was going to save me, that the last safety net I had been secretly counting on without admitting it to myself had never actually been there at all. Not really, not in the way I needed. I folded the towel, I said, "Okay, Mom," in a voice that was absolutely flat, and I went upstairs and I got down on my knees and I pulled the old blue suitcase out from the very back of my closet. I packed the suitcase that night to be ready to leave. I want to be precise about that, because for years afterward I could not explain it cleanly even to myself. I was not planning to run away in the dark. I was not planning to flee without a word. I packed it because my father had told me I could find another roof, and a cold, clear, newly certain part of me had finally started to believe that he meant it. And a woman who may have to leave a room should already be ready to leave it before the moment arrives. So I packed methodically. 2 pairs of jeans, my good dark sweater, the used copy of Statics and Mechanics of Materials I had bought with my own money and told no one about, my taped-together acceptance letter folded and tucked into the inside jacket pocket where it could not be bent or damaged further, socks, a photograph of my grandfather taken from the hallway wall, the only one where he was laughing, the one I was certain no one would notice was missing. I packed the way you study for a final exam, carefully and without waste, folding each thing into a neat square. When the bag was full, I slid it under the bed, back against the wall where the shadows were deepest, and I lay down on top of the covers and felt something I had never felt in 19 years in that house. Not hope. Hope was the tender and stupid thing that had died next to the pot roast 2 weeks ago. This was different, harder and cleaner than hope. It was readiness. It was the knowledge that whatever happened at the end of these remaining days, I would not be caught unprepared and begging. I would have my life packed and waiting under my bed, and if the moment came when I had to choose between this house and my own future, I would not waste a single second looking for what to bring. I would just pick it up and go. I did not know yet that the moment would come exactly where all the other moments in this family had always come, at that long wooden table under the kitchen light. I did not know my grandmother had been packing something of her own in a gold-lettered law office for far longer than I had been packing a blue suitcase. But I was ready, and readiness, it turned out, was the one thing nobody in that house had ever thought to take from me, because they never knew I had it. My grandmother saw the suitcase 2 days later. I had not meant for her to. She came into my room to return a book she had borrowed months ago, and the corner of the blue case was showing, just an edge of it catching the light from the hallway. She looked at it for a long, still moment. I braced myself for the conversation I expected, the one about loyalty and family and not doing something I would regret. It did not come. Instead, she sat down on the edge of my bed, the way she had the night of the tea, and she was quiet. And then she said the sentence I have carried inside me every day of my life since that evening. "Good," she said.
A woman should always be able to leave a room. She reached down without asking and pushed the suitcase a few inches further into the shadow so the corner would not show. Then she straightened up and looked at me with those eyes that were always filing, always cataloging, always keeping track of more than anyone in that family ever imagined. My mother, she said after a moment, could not leave. She stayed 40 years in a house that told her she was nothing but a pair of hands. She died inside it, still believing them. She smoothed her skirt with one deliberate motion. I made myself a promise a long time ago that no woman in this family would ever again be trapped in a room she could not walk out of on her own.
It has taken me most of my life to be in a position to keep that promise, but I am close now. I asked her what she meant, what she was close to. She only patted my knee once and stood. "Keep that bag packed, Grace," she said, and then she stopped and corrected herself with the smallest smile. "Keep that bag packed, Clara, but keep your seat at that dinner table a little while longer. There is something I want you to see." And she left. I lay awake for 3 hours that night, turning her words over and over, trying to find the shape of what a quiet 79-year-old woman with a law firm envelope and a straight spine was waiting to show me. And then something happened that I had not expected, something that shifted the balance of those last few days in a way I still think about. My brother Brandon came to my door late on a Wednesday night. He knocked so quietly I almost missed it. He was 16 and gawky, and he smelled like the shop because he had started spending afternoons there after school, learning at our father's elbow, the way our father was grooming him to do. He stood in my doorway and did not quite look at me and held out his closed fist. When I reached out, he dropped a folded $50 bill into my palm. He said, "It's from my birthday money." He said, "I know it's not enough." He said, "I heard you on the phone with the university." I didn't say he was wrong. I didn't tell him it was too small to matter practically, because it was not too small to matter in every other way. I said, "Brandon?" That's all, just his name. He shrugged with all the elaborate casualness of a 16-year-old boy who is embarrassed to be doing something kind. He said he didn't think Dad was right about the school. He said he thought I would be good at engineering. He said it quickly and looked at the floor, and then he left before I could say anything else. I stood in my room holding $50 and thinking about the machine, the one that had been running through this family for generations, handing each boy a throne and each girl a smaller cage. And I thought that maybe, sometimes, a boy could look at the machine and feel the weight of what it was asking him to become. Maybe that was the beginning of something. I added the $50 to the envelope in my drawer. Still not enough, but I kept it apart from the rest because it felt like something different. It felt like the first crack in a wall I had thought was solid all the way through. I made one last honest attempt at the front door, because that is who I had been trained to be. 4 days before the deadline, I wrote the entire case out on a single sheet of paper, the way I wrote everything, organized and precise, with the numbers in columns and the logic laid out simply. The scholarship percentage, the deposit amount, the starting salary for a structural engineer 3 years out of school, the comparison to what my father cleared annually from the shop. I sat down across from him after supper, and I kept my voice low and even, and I said, "Dad, I'm not asking you to pay for anything. I'm asking you to look at the numbers, just the numbers." He picked up the paper. He read it. I watched him, and for one suspended breath, I thought the numbers might accomplish what nothing else had been able to. Then he laughed, a short, dismissing sound, the laugh you give a child who has built a precarious tower of blocks. "A girl engineer," he said, sliding the paper back across the table toward me. "You'd be the joke of every job site from here to the coast. They would not take you seriously, and when they didn't, you would have nothing left." He said it gently, like he was pulling me back from a cliff edge, like he was doing me a kindness. That was the thing about my father that the rest of the world could never see from the outside. In his own mind, in the story he lived inside, he was protecting me. He was not twisting a knife. He was catching me before I fell. And you cannot argue a man out of a cruelty he is confused with love. I took my paper back. I folded it in half precisely. I said, "Okay, Dad." I went upstairs, and I put the paper in the suitcase, and I understood I had knocked on the last door available to me, and it too was stone all the way through. 3 days out, I was sitting on my bed with a calling card phone, dialing the number for Harrington's enrollment office,
because I had decided that I would withdraw with dignity, rather than let the seat expire in silence. I would tell them I could not confirm. I would ask quietly, already knowing the answer, whether there was any possibility of extending the deadline. My hands were cold. I got through the automated menu. Press 1 for enrollment.
I sat there with my thumb hovering over the button, and I heard my grandmother's voice from 2 nights before. Keep your seat at that table just a little longer. There is something I want you to see. I did not know why I trusted it. Every other person in that house had failed me, one after another, each in their particular way. But the woman at the cold end of the table, who had gone every Thursday to a law office on 2nd Street and come home with a cream envelope pressed to her chest, the woman who had asked me real questions about load and stress for an hour over chamomile tea, the woman who had looked at my packed suitcase and said good instead of no, she had never once told me something that wasn't true. I put the phone down without pressing anything, and I made the decision, sitting there alone in my room with the late afternoon light coming through the curtains, to give her one more dinner, one more meal at that table. Whatever came of it, after that meal, I would pick up my bag and I would walk out of that house, and I would figure out the rest on my own 2 feet, the way I had built everything else. And if that meant losing the scholarship seat, I would start over and earn another one. That decision, made quietly alone, was without any question the most important choice I have ever made in my life. That same night, my grandmother came to my room and closed the door behind her, which she had never once done in my memory. She sat down in my desk chair and turned it to face me and folded her hands on her knees. "It's time you understood something about this house," she said, "and I'm going to say it only once, so pay attention." I sat very still, and I listened with everything I had. "Your grandfather," she began, "was a hard man in most ways, no better in many respects than your father, but he was not a fool about money, and he trusted nobody, and I do mean nobody, least of all his own son. When he died 22 years ago, he did not leave this house to Douglas." She paused and let that settle in the room. "He did not leave the land to Douglas. He did not leave the company to Douglas. He left all of it to me. Every acre, every share, every board and nail. The deed to this house has carried one name for 22 years, and that name has never been your father's. It is mine." "My father," I said, and my voice came out strange. "He acts like he owns everything. He makes every decision." "Yes," my grandmother said, and the weight of what she was not saying sat heavy in those 2 letters. "He does act like it. I have allowed him to act like it for 22 years, because it cost me nothing, because it kept the peace in this house, while I watched and waited and learned exactly what kind of man he was when he believed no one could stop him." She looked at me without blinking. "Now I know, and I have seen more than enough." Down the hall, I could hear my father laughing at something on the television, comfortable, loud, absolutely certain of the ground beneath his feet. And I understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt like cold water, why my grandmother had always chosen the cold end of the table. She had never needed the head. She had owned the whole room from the beginning, and she had let my father sit in a throne that was always borrowed, and she had watched him, and she had waited. "Why now?" I asked her. "Why tell me now and not before?" My grandmother was quiet for a moment, selecting her words the way she did everything, deliberately, without waste. "Because for 22 years," she said, "I have been watching everyone in this family to see who would actually build something real. Not who would take, not who would shout the loudest at the head of a table they assumed was theirs. Who would make something out of nothing, with their own hands and their own mind, and still treat people with decency while they did it." She leaned forward slightly. "I owed that much to your grandfather's money before I let it go anywhere. And I watched your father spend 2 decades running a company he thinks he built into exactly the kind of mediocrity his own father would have recognized. I watched him raise your brother to expect the world without earning it. And I watched an unassuming 19-year-old girl teach herself structural engineering at a public library table, earn a scholarship that not one person in this family lifted a finger to help her get, and then say, 'I'm sorry for ruining dinner,' while her father tore it in half in front of her. Her voice went very quiet. I am not doing this to be kind to you, Clara. Understand that. Kindness would be easy, and it would be wrong. I am doing it because it is right, because it is overdue.
And because I have finally, after all this time, found the person in this family who actually deserves it. You happen to be that person. She stood. Get some sleep. Tomorrow at dinner, you sit in your seat, you keep your bag by the stairs, and you let me do the talking. Every single word of it. Do you understand me? I said yes. It was the truest yes of my life. Before she left, she set the cream envelope from Caldwell & Pierce on my desk and did not open it. Just let me see the weight and the thickness of it. I have spent the past 4 months with an attorney named Dana Caldwell, she said. A thorough one. We have built something together that cannot be torn up at a dinner table or anywhere else. Then she said goodnight, and she left me alone with the lamp and the envelope, and a question I had been living inside my whole life without knowing what it was. I want to tell you what I felt in that room after she left, because it surprised me and I think it matters. It was not relief.
It was not triumph. It was, of all things, a sharp and immediate shame. Because I realized, sitting there looking at that cream envelope, that some part of me, some deep and stubborn part that I had never been willing to look at directly, had still been waiting to be rescued. Still waiting for my father to change his mind. Still waiting for my mother to stand up. And now waiting for my grandmother to swoop in and hand me everything wrapped in legal paper. I was about to trade one kind of dependence for another and call it freedom. And I did not want it that way. Grandma, I said, and she had not yet fully left the room. She turned in the doorway. I don't want to be given anything, I said, and my voice was steadier than it had ever been in that house. I built all of this myself. I want to keep building it myself. I just need a door I can walk through under my own power. That is all I have ever needed. That is the only thing. My grandmother stood in my doorway for a long moment and looked at me. And then she smiled, fully, completely, the first full smile I had seen on her face in 19 years of watching her. And she said, "That right there, that answer, that is exactly what I have been waiting 18 years to hear you say." She did not explain it then. She did not have to. I understood it fully the next evening at the table. I barely slept. I lay in the dark, turning everything over. And slowly, in the way that real understandings come, not in a flash, but in the accumulation of small recognitions, the true shape of my whole life came clear to me. All these years, I had told myself I wanted the scholarship and the laboratory and the degree and the distance. Those were real, and I did want them. But underneath those wants was something older and more wounded and more honest, something I had never let myself name completely. I had wanted my father to be proud of me.
That was the door I had been knocking on since I was small enough to barely reach the handle. Every dish I carried and stacked and washed, every silence I stepped into and softened, every apology for existing in too large a way, all of it had been one long, continuous knock on a door that was never going to open. And here was what I had never been willing to see fully before. The scholarship would not have opened it either. If I had walked into that kitchen with a Nobel Prize, my father would have found a different way to reduce it, to reframe it, to make it evidence of something wrong with me rather than something right. Because the problem had never been my worth. The problem was that he had decided before I was born that a daughter's worth was not something that counted in the ledger he kept. I could exhaust myself building and achieving and proving for the rest of my life, and I would never buy a look of pride from a man who had made himself willfully blind to what I was. And I chose, lying alone in the dark the night before the last dinner, to stop knocking. Whatever happened at that table the next evening, whatever my grandmother produced from that cream envelope, I was done. Done begging to be seen by a person who had chosen not to see me. Done apologizing for the space my life required. The choice I made that night in the dark was the only choice that ever actually mattered. Every other thing that happened was a consequence of that one decision. In the morning, my grandmother found me in the kitchen before the others woke. Tonight, she said, pouring her tea without looking up. It ends tonight. I asked her if she was certain, if she had thought about what this would cost her, because once she did whatever she was about to do, the family would not reassemble the way it had been. My father would not forgive it. The house would never be quiet in the same way again. Grandma, I said, you don't have to burn everything down for me. I've decided. I'm leaving tonight, regardless, with or without anything from you. You don't have to do this. She set down the teapot and turned and looked at me, and her face was completely calm. Child, she said, I told you twice now, I am not doing this for you. I am doing it because it is right, and because a promise I made to myself 40 years ago is finally coming due. She reached up and buttoned the top button of her good wool coat, though she was not going anywhere that morning, and I would come to understand that this was her tell, the gesture she made when a decision was made and would not be unmade. Tonight, she said, I am going to say one thing to your father that he will not believe, and when he laughs, because he will laugh, I am going to put something on that table, and he will stop laughing. She paused. You sit in your seat with your bag by the stairs. When it is done, you are going to have a choice to make, a real one.
And I want you to make it with your own 2 feet, exactly the way you told me you wanted to. Then she rinsed her cup and set it in the rack with the same precision with which she set down her fork every evening, and the day began. I moved through that day in a peculiar stillness, the stillness of someone who has already jumped and is waiting for the landing. I brought my suitcase downstairs in the late afternoon and set it behind the coat rack near the bottom of the stairs, where the shadows were deep. I went through my homework. I set the table for 5, because some habits are so old they move your hands without your permission. My father came home from the shop, loud and easy and certain. He clapped Brandon on the shoulder and said, This one's going to run the whole operation someday, just you watch.
Brandon looked across the room at me and said, not with meanness, simply with the unconscious accuracy of a boy who has absorbed every unspoken rule of a house he was raised in, You could always do the bookkeeping, Clara. Girls have neat handwriting. He was 16. He was repeating what the machine had told him, the same machine that had told my father, the same machine his grandfather had built and believed in and handed down like an heirloom. I was not angry at Brandon. Not anymore. I was thinking about the $50 bill, about the boy who had knocked on my door late at night and held out his closed fist. Maybe the machine was not quite as solid as it looked from the outside. Maybe it had cracks. We sat down at 6, my father at the head in the warm light, my mother to his right, Brandon across from her, me wherever there was room, and my grandmother at the far end, by the window, spine straight, hands folded, waiting. My father was in fine form. He carved the chicken and held forth about a new contract he was negotiating and a piece of equipment he was thinking about buying. And at some point, as he always did, he found his way around to me. Grafe here has been moping about her little school fantasy, he announced to the table, and I did not correct the name. I let it go. It did not matter anymore. She'll come around. Give her a year working somewhere sensible, and she'll understand I was doing her a favor all along. He pointed his fork at me, not unkindly, just as a man points at a thing he is certain of. You'll see, honey. This is me looking out for you. And at the far end of the table, my grandmother set down her fork. She placed it in the exact center of her plate, with the precision I knew by now was never accidental. She folded her napkin. She stood. My father stopped talking mid-sentence. My grandmother reached behind her chair for her wool coat and put it on, standing there at the dinner table, one button at a time, slowly, in a silence that spread through the whole room like something poured from a height. Then she looked down the length of that table at her son, and she said in a voice that was completely level and completely certain, and not loud at all, "Go pack, Douglas. Clara starts at Harrington in the fall." Nobody breathed. My father stared at her. And then he laughed. A real, surprised, genuine laugh. The laugh of a man who has heard something so far outside the possible that his body defaults to amusement. He leaned back in his chair, completely at ease in his own kingdom. "Go pack," he said. "Mother, this is my house, my land, my company. I built all of this.
If you want to send her to school, you go right ahead and do it on your Social Security. But you don't come to my table and tell me to pack." My grandmother did not laugh. She reached into the pocket of her buttoned coat and she removed a single folded document, and she placed it on the table and slid it. It traveled the full length of that long wooden table, spinning slightly, and came to rest against the edge of my father's dinner plate. He looked at it. He did not touch it right away. "What's this?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. It was the voice of a man who has felt the earth shift beneath him and is pretending he is standing on solid ground. "Open it," my grandmother said. He flipped it open. I watched his eyes find the top of the page and go still. I watched them go back to the top again, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something else if he read them again. The deed to the house. I could see it from where I sat. The county seal. The recording stamp.
And in the space designated for the owner's name, in clear, irrevocable type, it did not say Douglas Whitmore. It said Eleanor Whitmore. Only that. One name. His mother's. "This is old," my father said, and his voice had changed, gone thin and hollow. "This is from before Dad died. This was going to be transferred. My grandmother said your grandfather transferred everything to me 22 years ago, and it has remained in my name from that day to this. The house you sleep in, the land your shop sits on, the company whose name you sign checks with. You have operated it, Douglas. You have lived inside it and raised your children inside it, and sat at the head of it every night and told everyone at this table what was going to happen and why. But you have not owned a single inch of any of it. Not once. Not for one day." My mother's hand was over her mouth. Brandon was staring at our father as though the man had changed shape.
And my father, the man who had always sat where the light was best, sat holding a deed with his mother's name on it, and said nothing for the first time in my memory. He found his voice the way men like him always do. "You can't do this," he said, standing now, his chair scraping back against the floor. "I have run this. I have built this up. You sat in that chair for 22 years and watched me work, and now you want to take it away because of her?" He meant me. He pointed. "Because she got some letter?" My grandmother was still standing, still buttoned, still composed. "I'm not taking anything from you that was ever yours," she said. "I'm clarifying what was never yours to begin with." And then she reached into her coat again and placed the second document on the table, the Caldwell and Pierce envelope, thick and cream and final. "3 months ago," she said, "I placed all of it into an irrevocable trust. The house, the land, the shares, every account. It is done. It is signed and recorded. And it is beyond the reach of anyone at this table, including me." She looked at him steadily. "The trust provides for your continued management of the business under oversight, and it provides this family's housing as it always has. But the decisions about what belongs to whom and who this family invests in are no longer yours alone to make." My father sat down. I had never seen my father sit down like that before. Not deflated, not uncertain, just sat down, the way a man sits when the floor has been taken out from under him. "Why?" he said, and there was something raw in it, something almost small. "Why would you do this to me?" My grandmother's voice, for the one and only moment that night, went gentle. "I didn't do it to you, Douglas. I did it because an 18-year-old girl taught herself engineering at a public library and earned a scholarship that every person at this table should have been celebrating, and instead of celebrating it, you tore it up between bites of your dinner." She let that sit, and I decided I had watched long enough. Then she turned and looked at me. The whole table turned with me, and I felt the pull of it, the old, hot human pull of justice turning on its axis, of finally sitting where the power was and watching the man who had decided I was worth nothing find out what nothing really felt like. My grandmother slid the trust document toward me. "It can all be overseen by you," she said quietly. "Every decision. You could stay right here in this house and learn what it costs to be told your entire life that you don't matter." And I sat with that for a long, full breath.
I felt the wanting of it. I will not lie and say I didn't. And then I stood up. No, I said. And I looked at my grandmother, not my father, because she was the only person in that room who I needed to understand. I don't want the house. I don't want to sit at the head of any table in this family.
I don't want to spend one more day of my life being measured in a room that has never been able to see me clearly. I looked at the lamp over the table, the warm light that had always fallen on my father's place, and I thought about every meal I had carried to that table, and every silence I had smoothed, and every time I had said sorry for taking up the space my own life required. I want what you set aside for my education, I said, in my name, where only I can reach it, and I want to walk out of here on my own 2 feet, the way I built everything else. That's all, because I understand now. I stopped knocking on a door that was never going to open, and the freedom of that, the clean and surprising freedom of simply stopping, is worth more than anything in that trust document. My grandmother's eyes shone in the kitchen light. She said that the attorney had already established an education fund in my name, set aside separately, before the trust was even filed. In your name, she said. Unreachable by anyone else. You choose what it's for. You choose when you use it. The rest of the trust runs as I've set it out. And I understood in that moment that I had just passed a test that had begun the night she walked into my room carrying 2 cups of tea and asked me a real question about load and stress. She had not been offering me money. She had been measuring what I would do when offered power I had not earned. I turned to my father. He was still sitting, the deed in one hand, a man in a chair that had turned out to be borrowed for 22 years. For the first time in my memory, he had to look up to meet my eyes, rather than down. I was not angry. That surprised me most of all. I felt something closer to pity, and under the pity, a line drawn in solid ground. You didn't tear up my future, Dad, I said quietly. You tore up a piece of paper. And then you showed me the one thing I never quite understood until tonight. My future was never in your hands.
It was never anywhere but mine. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I have spent 19 years trying to make you proud of me, I said. I'm done. Not because I stopped caring, because I finally understand that you were never going to be able to, and that was never about anything I did or didn't do. It was decided before I was born, and it had nothing to do with me. I hope someday you figure out what that cost you. I really do. I picked up my plate, out of pure 19 years of habit, and then I set it back down and left it where it was, because carrying the dishes was not my job anymore. And I walked to the coat rack by the stairs, and I reached into the shadow, and I picked up the blue suitcase that had been packed and waiting for 11 days. My mother made a sound then, a small fractured sound, the sound of a woman arriving too late at an understanding she had been avoiding for years. Grace, she said, and then she used my right name, Clara. I turned. I looked at her, and I felt the old pull to smooth it, to soften it, to say sorry and mean it to make her feel better. I didn't. I said, "Goodbye, Mom." And I meant it kindly, and I meant it for good. My grandmother walked me to the front door. In the hallway under the coats that hung left to right by height, she stopped me with one hand on my arm, and she reached up and buttoned the top button of my jacket, the way she had buttoned her own coat at the dinner table an hour before, one button at a time, her hands perfectly steady. Mine, I realized, had finally stopped shaking. "There," she said. "Now you're ready to leave the room." I started to cry, and I did not stop myself. "Come with me," I said. "You don't have to stay here with all of this." She shook her head, gently but completely. "This is still my house," she said. "I'll decide what happens under this roof from now on, and I intend to enjoy it." And there it was, the smallest flash of that dry and patient humor she had been keeping in her coat pocket for decades at the cold end of a table she had always owned. "You go build your bridges, Clara. Call me on Sundays. Tell me about the load and the stress."
She put one hand against my cheek, warm and dry and steady. A mind like yours, she said, is the most valuable thing this family will ever produce. Your grandfather knew it the day he met you. Now you know it too. I held her for a long time, and she held me back with a strength that had nothing to do with 79 years, and everything to do with 40 years of patience finally releasing itself all at once. Then she opened the door. The night outside was cool and wide and very still. The fields at the edge of the property were silver in the dark. The whole enormous world was out there waiting, patient as she had always been, like a question I finally had the right answer to. I picked up the blue suitcase. I stepped over the threshold.
And behind me, for the first time in 19 years, I did not turn around to see whether anyone had noticed I was gone. I confirmed the scholarship with 1 day remaining on the deadline, using the education fund Dana Caldwell had established in my name, and I rode a bus 312 miles with one blue case and a taped letter in my inside pocket. The dorm was loud and small and full of people who had no idea I had ever been the quiet one at the far end of a table. In the engineering lab at Harrington, for the first time in my life, nobody asked me to keep the books or carry the dishes or apologize for understanding how things worked. They handed me the calculations, and I was good, genuinely and seriously good, and everyone who worked alongside me knew it. My father did not lose his world because the trust Dana Caldwell had designed was careful and solid. He retained his management role under oversight, and he continued to live on Hollow Creek Road.
What he lost was the illusion that the ground had ever belonged to him. I am told he is quieter at the dinner table now. I am told he still sits where the light is warmest, out of habit, because some patterns outlast the beliefs that built them. But everyone at that table understands now exactly what the head of a table is worth. My mother and I speak, sometimes, carefully, across distance. She wrote me a letter in my second year at Harrington, a long letter that took her months to send. She said she was sorry. She said she had spent so long inside a story someone else wrote for her that she had forgotten she could write her own. It was the bravest thing I had ever seen her do. I wrote back. It was a beginning, not a resolution. Those are different things. Brandon called me junior year because the $50 bill had been the beginning of something, after all.
He asked me what engineering was really like, what a girl in that program faced, what I thought he should know before he assumed he understood anything. I told him everything. I was not gentle about it. He deserved the truth more than he deserved my comfort. And I called my grandmother every Sunday, exactly as promised, and told her about my load and my stress and my projects and my professors and the particular satisfaction of calculating the weight a structure can bear and building it to hold just that much and no more. She listened the way she had always listened, filing everything away, her voice sharp and interested and warm across the phone line, a woman who had finally arranged her house exactly the way she wanted it and found she had quite a lot of energy left over. I am a structural engineer now. I design bridges.
My grandmother finds this hilarious in the way that very wise people find certain things hilarious, because she says, I have spent most of my adult life calculating how much weight something can carry, which is, she points out, exactly what I have always done. She is 91. She still sits at the cold end of the dinner table. She still owns every board foot of that farmhouse on Hollow Creek Road. She still runs the family company through a manager she trusts. And over the past several years, she has brought me in quietly to redesign the parts that my father's certainty let fall into disrepair. We work well together, the two of us, across the distance, on the phone on Sunday evenings. The world has not been fixed. I want to be clear about that, because I think you deserve the truth instead of the comfortable version. Somewhere tonight, a man at a table somewhere is deciding that his daughter's ambition is money wasted. A piece of paper is being torn. A girl is saying she is sorry. That machine is older than my grandfather, and it will outlast me, but it does not run through me anymore. My grandmother reached back across 40 years of patience and broke one link of it for one girl with one deed and one trust document and one cup of chamomile tea and one real question about how much weight a bridge can hold. And that girl is here, building things,
and telling the girls behind her that their worth was never a thing that belonged to anyone at any table. Not to the man at the head, not to the silence at the far end, not to the fear in the laundry room. It belongs to the person who does the work. It always did. You break a chain one link at a time, or you do not break it at all. The night my father tore up my acceptance letter, he thought he was tearing up my future. What he actually did was show me, clearly and without any remaining ambiguity, that my future had never been in his hands. It was in my own. And the day I stopped waiting for him to give it back to me was the day I finally reached out and picked it up. If you are sitting at a table right now that measures you wrong, I want you to know this. The quiet woman at the far end may have been holding the whole room in her lap this entire time, and so, possibly, have you. That is the story. Thank you for staying with it all the way through. If it reached something real in you, tell me in the comments about the room you walked away from, or the one you're still sitting in, gathering your readiness. Subscribe to Story Sentence so you are here for the next one. And if this story mattered to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.